Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with my esteemed colleagues, Kate Odell and Kim Strassel, talking about the highlights of 2022 and what it means for the future. And let's just talk about the Supreme Court, because that, of course, did get a lot of attention this year, particularly for its decision to overturn Roe v. Wade after decades where that seemed to be impossible. That had implications, obviously, for the election, though not what abortion rights advocates had feared. They actually have emerged stronger politically coming out of it. But there were other decisions in the court, gun rights case in New York State, saying that there's an individual right to carry guns outside the home, not merely for home defense. Something called the Major Questions Doctrine in West Virginia v. EPA, which said that when regulatory agencies are making decisions with major implications for society or the economy, they must have clear direction from Congress. They can't just rewrite the law. And that had played into the court's decision to stop the vaccine mandate that was imposed by OSHA, and as well as the moratorium on rent payments by the CDC. And all in all, Kate, a historic year on the court.
Yeah, Paul, I think you do have to dwell on the courage it took for the justices to come to what was obviously the right constitutional decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, even though the political fallout may be considerable. And even though it happened after a draft opinion leaked and just a historic violation of the confidentiality of the chambers, that was clearly designed to intimidate the court in one fashion or another. And so I think the decision to follow through on that decision is an important one. And to your point about the politics of it, it has been different than I think both sides would have predicted. Abortion is not illegal across the country. Many states still allow it. Also, it may have muted Republican success in the midterms. Republicans might have overestimated the extent to which that issue is going to work in their favor. So I think what we're having now is what the country has needed, which is a debate on the topic that will be messy at times and play out differently in different parts of the country, but will be better than imposing a policy from justices on the Supreme Court.
Let's settle abortion as a matter of political debate in the states. I think that's where we're going, and that's going to probably help Democrats. I think it already did. Clearly in Michigan it did in this last election, and I would argue it did in some other states as well. Looking into next year, the court's taking a major racial preferences case regarding Harvard and North Carolina admissions practices. It's going to take on student loan cancellation decision by President Biden, which, as you suggested, Kim, is illegal and certainly in my view, a lawless decision worth $400 billion, by the way, just adding that to our taxpayer liabilities. There's a free speech case involving a wedding website designer and gay marriage. And all in all, it could be shaping up as another blockbuster.
Yeah, and they're not done taking cases yet. There are a number of groups that are petitioning for cert right now. So we're likely to see them add to the docket. And I think that's a really important point to note as well, which Kate talked about the courage the court had to come to the decision it did in Dobbs. But I think the kind of even broader courage here is a court that, now that it has 6 conservatives and more of a solid conservative majority, has finally, and so overdue, been willing to take on these issues and hear these cases. I mean, you mentioned that New York State rifle and pistol case, a guns rights issue, and a major Second Amendment decision. You know, it had been more than a decade since the court had done anything to clarify its earlier rulings, including Heller, in which they declared that the Second Amendment did have in it an individual right to bear arms. And that had left the lower courts to make it up as they went along. And so now we suddenly have a court willing to look at abortion, willing to look at Second Amendment, free speech, religious liberty. It was a banner year this last year for religious liberty cases, racial preferences. So that's what's exciting to me, is that some of these really big questions of jurisprudence that have been ignored for such a long time are finally getting some clarification from the court.
This was the year in which the demand for court packing by some parts of the Democratic Party ran into a wall of opposition. The president's appointment of a commission on the courts deciding not to endorse that option. And of course, with the failure of Democrats to overturn the filibuster in the Senate, thanks to the opposition of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. They lacked the votes to change the court, though it was a close-run thing. I think there would have been enormous momentum and pressure from below to do that, from the grassroots of the Democratic Party, from its activist wing, if they had had the votes, more votes in the Senate, but they couldn't break the filibuster. And so at least now with Republicans in charge of the House, that should be off the table for the next couple of years. But let's turn to the Democratic Congress and its legacy. We may not like it, I may not like it, but they passed an awful lot of legislation in the Inflation Reduction Act, which included enormous subsidies. Some lights $500 billion for green energy. You have the Semiconductor Industrial Policy Bill, the so-called CHIPS Bill, which subsidizes companies for investing in the United States. The Omnibus Bill, another $1.7 trillion. Nancy Pelosi, whatever you think of her, she really did deliver for the Democratic Party and its agenda, Kate.
Yeah, Paul, I'll start with the things that I would put in the category of could have been worse. We do have to note here that there were some failures. The Democrats really wanted to pass several broad entitlements during this Congress while they had full control, and they failed to do so. One of them was a national paid family leave program. Another one was a national universal entitlement for childcare. There was a $3,000 child tax credit for 2021 that was expired and has not been revived. These are especially important because they go on autopilot once Democrats pass them, and they become impossible to repeal. So that didn't happen. On the other side of the plus ledger, I would also put that we got a $45 billion plus up in national defense spending as part of the omnibus. That's one of the only bright spots of the bill, that basically now it will hold the department steady amid inflation. It will put some more money into Navy shipbuilding. It will stop some aircraft retirements, etc. I think that is another bright spot that was sorely needed, but pretty much everything else, the $1.7 trillion omnibus contains enormous domestic spending increases that will become part of what's called the baseline and become impossible to even return them to the pre-COVID spending levels, and they'll be difficult to cut. We also, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, some price controls on drugs that I think will really depress new drug investment at just a really important time when we're making advances in all sorts of fields and gene therapies and treatments for cancers. I think that's really regrettable as well and will be an unfortunate legacy of this Congress.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's the single worst thing that they passed, in my view, because it's going to have long legs. And while it starts slow in terms of the drugs that are subjected to price controls, the number will grow. And especially as we get more therapies and more drugs that are expensive because they're aimed at smaller populations, for example, more particularized cancer cures, there is going to be enormous pressure to keep the costs down. And that's going to inevitably have a terrible impact on drug innovation. Kim, I'm going to give you the last word on the Congress.
Yeah, I would just point out a couple of things, again, in the category of could have been worse, things that Democrats really wanted to get across the line if they had managed to get a couple more votes or broken the filibuster, which was something else they were trying to do. They didn't get their federal voting takeover, which was their plan to basically centralize and federalize all the rules across the nation. So that was good. Something that they didn't get done that we really wish they might have gotten done is any sort of immigration reform. And that is really having consequences for the country down at the southern border right now. We will see if that pressure at the border changes any dynamics, although I'm not much helpful. And then just to finish on a positive note, they did do one good thing this year, which was the gun legislation that they passed that is now going to allow an expansion to check the backgrounds and the juvenile records of younger Americans who have now turned 21 and are applying to get a firearm. Obviously, a lot of the shootings that we have had in recent years have all been traced to young and troubled men, many who do have records of mental illness and other things that should be raising red flags, but we weren't able to look at those before. This was a case of members of Congress coming together and trying to do something that might actually be of help.
All right, Kim, thank you for that. Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for listening. I hope everybody is having an enjoyable holiday season. We still have one more show here in the year of our Lord 2022, and we will be here tomorrow to talk some more about this past year and look ahead to 2023. Thanks for listening to Potomac Watch.